What does money have to do with salt? Why are lords and bread connected? And what on earth is the link between Vikings and wind? Etymology is the study of the origins of words. And in this lesson, we're going to have a bit of fun and look at some etymologies, the origins of some common everyday English words. Now, before I get started, I need to say that etymology isn't an exact science. They're commonly debated. The origins of some words are commonly debated. Some words, the etymology is completely unclear. For example, dog. Nobody knows where the word dog came from. It just kind of appeared and seemed to replace the word hund, which later became hound, as the dominant word for that four-legged friend. Other words have multiple theories as to their etymology, and some words are a bit more linear. But I just wanted to reinforce that etymology, sometimes you will hear multiple theories, but quite often they are dominated by good logic. However, some you do need to take with a pinch of salt. And that brings us on to our first one, the word salary. Salary comes from salt. Before I get started on the etymology, let's talk about the difference between wage and salary. A lot of students ask me this. Wage, which has a strong link to the word gauge, I'll save that for another lesson. Wage refers to the hourly or weekly amount of money you receive for work. So we talk about the hourly rate, the hourly wage. Salary refers to the monthly or annual amount you receive. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, and there's a popular belief that Roman soldiers were paid in salt, but it isn't quite true. However, salt was so valuable it was linked to wages and allowances. So you can see the letters S-A-L, which are at the start of salt, and salary, which is giving you that obvious link. The Latin word for salt, S-A-L. And interestingly, we still have an idiom related to money and salt, worth one's salt. If you say somebody is worth their salt, it basically means they are worth the money that they receive. She's a brilliant manager. She's really worth her salt. And I find it fascinating that the idiom stayed in line with the etymology. And before we continue, there is a free PDF that you can download in the description to learn even more. But hello, you wonderful people. Welcome to English Right Now. My name is British English teacher Roy, and I've been a teacher of English for nearly 16 years. And I am absolutely obsessed with etymology. I find it fascinating to study where words came from. So I wanted to share a bit of that with you today. Salary is already on the list, but now let's move to one that could be used every single day. Goodbye. It's not time for goodbye. Don't turn off the lesson just yet. But goodbye originally meant God be with ye, or God be with you. So when people said like farewell centuries ago, they often said God be with ye. It was like kind of saying safe travels, be safe. May God protect you. But over time, God be with you became goodbye. Every time you say goodbye, you're unknowingly using a tiny piece of medieval English. And also, I must say, goodbye is slightly more formal than the everyday version, bye. And sticking with the religious theme, I'm going to throw in a bonus, which is cor blimey. Now, cor blimey is a thing that sometimes people may say if they are surprised. Cor blimey, I can't believe it. Some people just say cor and blimey. So, blimey, did he get the job? Or, cor, can't believe that. But the origin of cor blimey, which isn't used as much as an entire phrase as it once was, is God blind me. This is a biblical reference. God blind me that I may see more clearly. God blind me became over time cor blimey, much the same way that God be with you became goodbye. And going back to that interesting point about goodbye, I always find it fascinating that in languages such as Portuguese and Spanish, you have a similar idea with adios, like adios, and adeus, like adeus. Both reference God in the goodbyes, in the leaving farewells. Moving away from religion and straight into Vikings, we have the word window. Window is actually a Viking word. Now, the Vikings had a huge influence on English. Window comes from Old Norse. It comes from this word, which meant wind eye, which kind of has a logical root. Other common Viking words in English include sky, egg, knife, husband, anger, take, they, them, and their. So without the Vikings, we wouldn't have take, they, them, or their. Many people don't realise that some of the most basic English words are actually Viking in origin, including one of my favourites, which is not really an everyday word, but it is berserk, to go berserk. I'm going to do a whole lesson on Viking words that still exist in English. But let's move on to the common question: why do we eat beef but we raise cows? This is one of the best examples of how the Norman conquest changed English. After the Normans arrived in 1066, there was a very distinct class split. The peasants, the poor people who normally looked after the animals, spoke Old English, the language that later became English. The aristocracy, the ruling elite, spoke a form of French. The result? Well, the peasants would be working with the animals and they would use a kind of Old English word, whereas the aristocracy would be eating the food, so they would be more likely to refer to the food in French. So you have animals in English and meat in French. In other words, there's a class divide between the animal and the product. Class divide created a really interesting linguistic split. So we have the word cow for the animal and beef, which comes from French, for the meat. Pig, pork, and for example, calf and veal. We also have the word sheep for the animal, but mutton for the meat. Now, mutton is still used to this day, but it refers to meat from older sheep. If it comes from younger baby sheep, we call it lamb. The meat is referred to as lamb, which is the same as an animal. So a baby sheep is called a lamb, and the meat is also called lamb. Those are both Germanic origin words. But what's fascinating is this linguistic split, which was effectively created by class divide, still exists nearly 1,000 years later. The word mortgage, which is the loan that you use to buy a house, dates back to late 14th century French, and it effectively translates, or it would translate as death pledge. Mort refers to death, and gage refers to pledge or promise. So effectively, you're making a pledge until your death, which anybody buying a house, they probably do feel like that at some point. The word plumber is strongly linked to the periodic table. Now, the chemical element lead, the symbol on the periodic table is Pb, and the Latin word for lead is plumbum. So the word plumber originally derives from somebody dealing in or working with lead, because a plumber would work with lead pipes. And notice that the B in plumber is silent. We don't say plumber. The origin of companion is absolutely lovely. It basically means with whom one eats bread. So Latin, we have the word com, which means with, and panis, which means bread. It's basically saying somebody you would eat bread with. I love that. If you're not professional, you are amateur. And it commonly means that you take part in an activity, especially a sport. We talk about amateur football or amateur dramatics, for pleasure, for joy, and not for pay. So what's the etymology? Well, again, anybody who speaks Latin may look at those first three letters, AMA, and realize it comes from amare, which means love. We still see that with amor in languages like Portuguese and Spanish. So the origin of the word amateur basically comes from love. So it's effectively saying somebody who does it for love, not for money. Nightmare has nothing to do with horses. What on earth am I talking about? Well, many people assume that the word mare in nightmare refers to a female horse. We still use that word. So mare can be female horse, but it has no link to nightmare. In Old English, a mare was the kind of supernatural creature, this demon, this horrible creature that was believed to sit on people's chests while they slept. So you'd be sleeping and there'd be this evil creature on your chest, sitting on your chest, that would cause frightening dreams. So nightmare was literally a visit from a night demon. That's awful. The origin of crayfish is one of my favourites in English. Crayfish came from French. Now, crayfish we use to refer to a kind of lobster, a crustacean that lives in the river, but it is not a fish. It is not a type of fish. So how on earth did we start calling a river lobster a crayfish when it's not really a fish? Well, it actually comes from the French word, which is this, like écrevisse. So effectively what happened is that French people would be calling it as an écrevisse, and the English of the time would hear a crayfish, a crayfish, a crayfish, a crayfish, and thus the word crayfish was born from the French word, and it is not linked to fish. Effectively, a word was born from misunderstandings. I find that fascinating. And please do let me know in the comments below your favourite etymologies, the favourite origins, your favourite word origins in the comments. I'd love to read more. The word girl these days refers to a female child, but in Middle English, it didn't specifically mean a female child. It referred to any young person. So it could refer to a young boy or a young girl. Only later on did it become associated exclusively with females, which is similar to a word that I often talk about, man. These days, I would refer to myself as a man and my wife as a woman. However, the word that man came from originally just meant person. It's where we get human and mankind. It is not referring to a male, it is referring to a human, a person. If you wanted to specify, you had wifman, which was for females, and for males, we had verman. Over time, that prefix, ver, died off, and we just had man and woman. But interestingly, we can still see that prefix were in the word werewolf, which basically means man-wolf. Breakfast literally means breaking a fast. A fast is a period of not eating. This one is beautifully simple. Break means to stop, and fast means not eating. So it effectively means stop not eating. So breakfast is simply the meal that breaks your overnight fast. The words lord and lady come from bread. This is really fascinating. These words have surprisingly humble origins. Lord comes from the Old English word, which is this, and this effectively meant loaf guardian, the person responsible for providing and looking after the bread, whereas the word lady comes from this word, which effectively meant something like bread kneader, the person responsible for preparing bread. So two of the highest titles in society had very domestic beginnings. School comes from a word meaning leisure. The Greek word is this, and it actually kind of meant free time and leisure. So what's the link between the school, where you get an education, and your free time? Well, education was something that people did when they weren't working. In other words, in their free time. Over centuries, that evolved into our modern word, school. I think some students may find that a bit ironic, that school comes from free time. Did you know that whiskey means water of life? Now, the word whiskey has Celtic and Scottish Gaelic origins. It comes from this or these words, which mean water of life. So these two words mean water of life. Over time, that first word changed its pronunciation and eventually became whiskey. Now, if you're worried about robots taking over, the Terminator idea, did you know that robots, the word robot, isn't originally English? Although it's really common in British English today, robot originally comes from Czech, this word, which means forced labour or servitude. It entered English after the 1920 play Rur, R-U-R. Alphabet comes from the first two Greek letters. We have alpha and beta. Combined, alpha and beta became alphabet. The word penguin, that probably Benedict Cumberbatch possibly hates, may have actually come from Welsh. Now I've got to say on this one, despite being associated with British explorers, linguists still debate its origin. But one theory suggests that it comes from Welsh. P-E-N means head, and gwyn means white. So effectively, it means white head. Ironically, the original word may have referred to a completely different bird that is now extinct. Q is one of the strangest spellings in English, but it originally comes from French. This word meaning tail. Now, in English, only the first letter really needs to be pronounced. Q is effectively the letter Q. And many people, many linguists, joke that you have the letter Q and then 4 letters waiting in a queue. English has borrowed heavily from so many languages, and that's why so many of these words that we see in a modern English dictionary come from languages such as French, Latin, Greek, Norse, Arabic, Dutch, German, Hindi, Italian, Spanish, and the Celtic languages, and so many others. It's why English often feels less like a single language and more like a linguistic museum filled with souvenirs from every civilization it has met. Remember, there's that free PDF that you can download, and please do remember to like and hype the lesson. It helps a lot of other people see it as well. But thank you very much for watching. Let me know your favorite etymologies down in the comments, and I'll see you in the next lesson.